Ambassador Goel, tell us what has been the biggest change in India's mindset since the 1962 war. Is there a greater sense of self-confidence now when we are facing off China?
I think the change in our mindset began to happen not now, not 10 years earlier, but I think more than 10 years earlier, even during Prime Minister Narendra Modi's time, there was a clear consciousness that if we want to strengthen our security in the border areas, the old philosophy of not developing infrastructure is not going to work.
Right.
Earlier, if we did not develop the infrastructure in the border areas, the philosophy was defensive.
Right.
We have become more proactive with the idea that we need to really project our power logistics into the border areas to be effective in defenses also. And therefore, right around 2010, there were delegations which went from here. I know that very well. I think it happened during the time when Ambassador Shamcharan, he was a foreign secretary, maybe around that time. And that's the reason I think 2010 or sometime, that it was around that time that we began to rethink and review our policy of the border defenses. And there was a serious recommendation at that time to build up infrastructure.
This is when China had already built up on the Tibetan plateau. They put out
China
the railroads.
had built up parts of it on the Tibetan plateau, etc. They were already building up. But we had not reacted to that.
Right.
Our border development was not a reaction to China's border development. We had two other factors. One is that our side of the border is actually not a plateau. Tibet is a plateau.
Yes.
It's easier to develop infrastructure on the Tibetan side, which is
and
level.
we are on the mountain slopes.
We are on the mountain slope.
Right.
It's not easy to really build all that network, etc.
Right.
So both the cost, feasibility, and also the need, the philosophy, they all came into play. Once we took a decision that yes, we need to build up our infrastructure, we have gone at that. But now I think the factor is coming in terms of the geographical stability of the terrain.
Right. And so we've actually seen the breakneck speed at which the roads and all are being constructed, and especially after Galwan. And we have this story on Galwan 2.0, we are calling it. There was a flashpoint in Arunachal Pradesh in December 2022 when the Indian Army repulsed a Chinese incursion into that area, which was a site of a clash in the 1962 war. And we'll just play that story out.
This particular event happened on 9th of December, and this is in the upper reaches of Tawang, which is a mountainous region, and of course China calls it as part of their southern Tibet, that the Indian Patrolling Party suddenly noticed that the Chinese were trying to transgress into the Indian territory. In this particular event on December 9th, there were fistfights that ensued. There were these melee weapons that were used, and finally there were injuries to at least 9 to 15 Indian soldiers, fractures that were reported, and then they were flown into Guwahati. And as per intelligence reports, there were at least, if not more, 25 Chinese PLA soldiers who had grievous serious injuries as well.
This area traditionally has been a disputed area. It's been a regular feature that the Chinese try and come in and that the Indian troops stop them from coming. The last instance was in October 2021.
Indian soldiers striking Chinese soldiers with batons, using fists to prevent the Chinese from advancing. This video from 2021 shows fierce fighting in the same area of Tawang in Arunachal Pradesh.
Particularly at a time when you know that you already have a problem which is ongoing on the LAC in eastern Ladakh. Trying to open up another front, trying to engage in this kind of activity, I would call it, very provocative and also highly sort of risky and dangerous.
3466 is the line of actual control, but if you look at our map, which the boundary we show in our Survey of India maps, that is 4,056 kilometers. So we'll talk of the line of actual control because the boundary which we show and China shows their own boundary. So there's a big international boundary, there's a big difference. China tries to creep inwards, southwards towards India, but we have not allowed them ever since I can remember now. Wherever they try to do it, we push them back.
So I wouldn't say it's something, as I said, is something new. Both sides had upped their military capability, military force levels. There was a report of 3 sort of brigades that had come in opposite the eastern sector from the Chinese side. We had also stepped up our infrastructure building. I won't say this is something that has suddenly happened.
From May of 2020, Chinese and Indian troops have engaged in a series of face-offs at multiple locations along the Sino-Indian border. In June of 2020, the two armies clashed in Galwan, which resulted in the deaths of Chinese and Indian soldiers.
According to my judgment, it is Xi Jinping. His strategy was to do something spectacular before the 20th Congress, which was held in October. Unfortunately, he didn't succeed. In fact, they lost more people than us. We lost 20, we declared it. They said we have lost only 2 or 4, whereas they lost something like 40, 50, 60. God knows, Western analysis and sources tell us it's more than 40, 50. So they didn't tell their countrymen what has happened.
The Indians and the Chinese used melee weapons. The Chinese have been using these clubs that are spiked clubs. They have those spikes on it. There are other sticks, plastic as well as wooden sticks that are used, but there's no gun that is used. It was almost after 40 years of peace and tranquility agreement between the two countries that in Galwan, guns were fired so that there is dispersal of crowd. It wasn't at each other.
Now that clash less than a year ago tells us why India needs to be watchful along the LAC, and I want to bring in my colleague Aditya Rajkaul, who covered that flashpoint in Arunachal. Aditya, welcome. We're entering the 4th year of our winter deployment along the line of actual control. Multiple flashpoints across the LAC. Is there a possibility that China could use this lull along the border and our distractions with various other issues to pressurize us somewhere along the LAC?
Absolutely, that's been the mindset really for a very long time, and it isn't anything new. Of course, our policy towards China has drastically changed over the last 4 years, ever since Galwan really happened. But as you rightly pointed out, Sandeep, our documentary really focused on the second Galwan 2.0, and that was in Yangtze, in Arunachal, in the Tawang sector, where again there was a kind of intrusion. There was in fact almost like a fist fight and confrontation, in which 20 of our soldiers were injured. Although these were minor injuries, but this was yet another attempt just like Galwan. Of course, in Galwan, it happened after 40 years. There was some kind of firing as well, and we lost at least 20 to 21 of our soldiers. And ever since that, there's been a growing realization in New Delhi that we need to bring in a paradigm shift, both in our military policy and our diplomatic policy as well. We've been working on it, but I think much more needs to be done, including infrastructure, because China has been working on it for years together since the Sino-India war, and we have woken up to it much later. And you could actually see, if you visit to the front areas of Ladakh, Arunachal and several other LAC points, that on the other side there's massive construction that has happened. There are actually structures that have come in, and this intrusion has been happening continuously. In Depsang, for instance, there are 5 locations where there is a confrontation happening, and as you pointed out about Galwan, ever since that there have been 19 rounds of dialogue, but China does not want to relent at all.